The New York Times recently published a report about JPMorgan Chase. Now, JPMorgan has agreed to pay the penalties, to pay new penalties that total now up to about $20 billion. Now, federal prosecutors yesterday actually imposed a $1.7 billion penalty on the bank for failing to report Bernie Madoff when he was actually doing some suspicious activities. Now, get what that means. Bernie Madoff, the bank knew, or according to federal prosecutors, they determined that the bank knew that Bernie Madoff was up to some shady shit, and they did nothing. Why? Because Bernie Madoff was bringing in money, and that's what it's all about. Now, you would think that this fine and $20 billion worth of fines that have been levied against him by the government is going to hurt JPMorgan, right? You would think that, oh yeah, of course, that's a huge punishment. God, look at all that money. $20 billion. Well, apparently it hasn't hurt JPMorgan Chase at all. In fact, JPMorgan is actually doing better than ever. According to this New York Times report, the shares for JPMorgan Chase are actually up by 28%. And that's over the last year. Wall Street analysts estimate that it will earn up to as much as up to $23 billion in profit just this year alone. $23 billion in profit. Well, there you go. There's your fine, plus a little bit of $3 billion extra. Maybe they can throw a party. Now, you think this would hurt their image? You think this would actually make investors lose, or clients and shareholders actually lose confidence in the company? But that's not the case either. In fact, JPMorgan has actually taken steps to basically insulate their profits from these fines. Now, check it out. Now, JPMorgan actually set up a reserve legal fund so that they squirrel away some money to pay the federal regulators so it doesn't eat into their profits. So JPMorgan, the executives there, are probably going to have a nice, lavish bonus at the end of the year. Jason Goldberg, a bank analyst at Barclays, said, quote, JPMorgan makes $25 billion in revenue per quarter and has record capital. He also says the fines have been manageable in the context of the bank's earning capacity. And that's not just manageable. Eric Gordon, a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, he actually points out that, quote, JPMorgan shareholders may believe these billions of dollars don't count because they see them as extraordinary expenses. Oh yeah, it doesn't happen very often. JPMorgan's a good company. JPMorgan doesn't do anything wrong. So that's just a one-off thing. These fines from the regulators, just one-off things. You know, we're going to continue to make money. Look at how much money we're raking in now. But these allegations, these federal fines continue to pile up. So eventually, you would think that it would get to the point where some of these investors go, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should do a little bit more oversight of the banks. But that's not what's happening. No, in fact, banks continue to be deregulated. There's just a recent bill that came out probably about a month ago that further deregulated derivatives under Dodd-Frank. If you think Dodd-Frank is actually going to do anything to regulate the banks, you're deluding yourself. It's not going to do a damn thing. You know why? Because it's been picked apart ever since it was passed into law. Watered down, picked apart. There's almost nothing left. And they call it historic reform. Come on. Our banks are out of control. And they own the government. I mean, Wall Street owns Congress. The banks own Congress. They bought off pretty much every politician in Congress. That's how they can get away with this. This $20 billion fine to JPMorgan is a slap in the wrist. That's all it really is. It doesn't hurt them. It doesn't eat into their profits. And they even have a fund set up to handle this stuff while making more profits. This kind of behavior incentivizes the banks to take even more risks with your money and to fuck up and to get bailed out. Remember, they're too big to fail. The banks are literally too big to fail. And they're not going to let them now. They didn't let them before. They won't let them now because these banks are bigger than ever, bigger than before. You know, if this is their way of trying to hold the banks accountable, they have failed 100%. People need to start going to jail over this. A lot of people need to start going to jail for this. And you know what? Our banks need to be broken up so that they are no longer too big to fail or too big to manage. Now, that was another part in the New York Times article that I read, is that some of these analysts are saying, yeah, well, JPMorgan is so large, and some of these other banks are so large, that it's actually really, really hard to manage the people. Oh, that was their excuse for Bernie Madoff. Well, we didn't know what he was doing. This place is so huge, we can't even find Bernie. We didn't even know if he was still working here. I couldn't find his cubicle. Just another reason for the banks to be broken up. Smaller banks are easier to manage, and they're easier to hold people accountable. And they stop being too big to fail.